Welcome to the online training session on the topic of wages and working hours. This is the second session on Principle 4, Improve Livelihoods and Human Well-Being. If you have permanent or temporary workers, the criteria in this session applies to your farm. You need to ensure that you are paying them fair wages and giving them fair working hours. Critical Criteria 4.5 says that all workers need to receive a fair wage. What is a fair wage? A farm should pay at least the legal minimum wage. If there is a wage negotiated through a worker organization, and if it is higher than the legal minimum wage, that should be paid to the worker. If workers are paid based on the volume of harvest, you need to adjust their pay rate so that they receive at least the legal minimum wage for working 48 hours per week. If part of the wage is paid by goods and services, the proportion of the in-kind payment should not be more than 30% of the wage. You can offer in-kind payment, but workers always have a right to choose all the wage to be paid in cash unless in-kind payment is mandatory in the country by law. If workers are provided with work gear or equipment that are necessary for their work, its cost should not be deducted from the wage. Critical Criterion 4.8 prohibits practices to avoid provision of benefits to workers. Workers are entitled to benefits such as health insurance, paid vacations, and bonus as defined by the law of the country. These benefits should be provided to both permanent and temporary workers. For temporary or part-time workers, their benefits can be calculated proportionally. You cannot avoid the provision of benefits by subcontracting a service provider that sends you workers. If you use a service provider, such as a contracted spraying team, for example, you need to ensure that its workers are also provided with benefits. According to the criterion C4.21, all wages need to be paid on time. Delayed payment is very frustrating and troublesome for workers. You need to ensure that all wages, including overtime payment, are paid on time. All the payments and deductions need to be clearly explained to the workers so that they can verify whether they are being paid according to the agreement. You must have noticed that the same item costs more and more each year. That is inflation. For the workers to continue paying for the same items, the salary needs to be increased based on the inflation rate. Criterion A 4.27 asks for the wages to be increased based on the inflation rate at least annually. Let's do some quizzes on what you have learned so far. A large coffee farm hires harvesting workers and pays them according to the weight of the coffee cherries they harvest. An average worker harvests around 100 pounds of coffee cherries per day by working 8 hours. The farm pays $0.2 for each pound of coffee cherry harvested. The legal minimum wage in the country is $2 per hour for a farm worker. Is this farm compliant with the corresponding criterion? The answer is yes. An average worker harvests 100 pounds of coffee cherries per day, and each pound of cherries is paid at $0.2. 100 times of 0.2 is 20. Therefore, an average worker can earn $20 per day for working 8 hours. The legal minimum wage in the country is $2 per hour. If a worker works for 8 hours per day, the minimum wage per day would be $16. On the other hand, the farm is paying $20, which is more than the legal minimum wage. The farm is compliant with Critical Criterion 4.5. A tea farm provides rice, vegetable oil, and beans to each worker every month as in-kind payment for their wages. Most workers appreciate it very much, but one worker requested the farm to pay his wage 100% in cash. The price of the food items correspond to 10% of their monthly wage. In-kind payment of wages is not mandatory in the country. Can the farm continue the current form of payment to this worker? The answer is no. The in-kind payment is less than 30% of the wage, which is compliant. However, the worker prefers to receive cash rather than in-kind payment. Therefore, the farm cannot continue the current in-kind payment with this worker and has to pay 100% of his salary in cash. The following pay slip of a farm worker shows the details of payments and deductions of his wages. The minimum wage of the country for the type of work is 450 pesos per month, and the wage that has been agreed upon between the farm management and the labor union is 560 pesos per month. Is the worker's wage compliant with the corresponding criterion? The answer is no. On the payslip, you can see that the basic salary of this worker is 560 pesos, which is the amount that has been agreed between the farm management and the labor union. So, the amount of the basic salary is compliant. However, please pay attention to the list of deductions. There is a deduction for personal protective equipment. You should not deduct the cost of work gear or equipment from the wage. Therefore, this worker's wage is not compliant with critical criterion 4.5. A coffee farm has a spraying team that has been working for the farm for the past 2 years. According to the law of the country, employers need to provide workers with benefits such as health insurance, paid vacations, and annual bonuses. The law does not require these benefits to be offered to temporary workers who work for less than 6 months. In order to avoid the payment of benefits, the farm fires these workers every 6 months and hires them back again. The same workers have been fired and hired 4 times. This farm is still meeting the law. Does this farm's action comply with the corresponding criterion? The answer is no. The farm is intentionally firing and hiring the same workers repeatedly to avoid the provision of benefits. This is against critical criterion 4.8. Now let's talk about the next topic, working hours. Critical criterion 4.10 requires fair working hours. What are fair working hours? Regular work is maximum 48 hours per week. After working for 6 consecutive days, there is 1 day of rest. On exceptional cases, workers can work for 12 consecutive days and take 2 days of rest. For every 6 hours of work, 1 meal break is provided. What about overtime? The regulations are written in Critical Criterion 4.11. Overtime work needs to be voluntary. Including overtime, the total working hours should not exceed 60 hours per week. 60-hour limits can be exceeded for emergency cases, whereby the crop is at risk of a significant loss. Additional workers cannot be hired immediately. The exceptional situation does not last more than 2 weeks, and it does not occur more than twice a year. Overtime work needs to be paid at the rate required by law, or the rate that has been collectively negotiated, whichever is higher. If an applicable law or a negotiated rate is absent, overtime should be paid at 1.5 times higher than the regular rate. All workers deserve paid vacations. Full-time workers should receive 2 weeks of paid vacations per year. Temporary or part-time workers should receive corresponding number of vacation days. For example, half-time workers should receive 1 week of paid vacations per year. Vacation days should not be exchanged with money. Pregnant female workers have special rights. According to Criterion B 4.25, pregnant women should receive maternity leave of at least 12 weeks, out of which at least 6 weeks should be taken after birth. During the maternity leave, they should receive a full salary. During pregnancy, after birth, and while nursing, The female workers deserve work arrangements that allow them to care for the baby. For example, they should be able to nurse their babies. You can give them frequent breaks for breastfeeding or let them go home earlier to breastfeed. Depending on the type of work, they can work from home, or you could set up a place with privacy where they can nurse their baby. Lastly, all these details of work condition that we have seen in this session should be written in a labor agreement so that the workers are fully aware of the work condition before they start the work. A labor agreement should include job description, working hours, pay rate, overtime regulation, benefits, deductions, paid vacations, protection in case of illness, disability, or accident, and notice period for contract termination. A labor agreement should be written in the worker's native language. If a worker cannot read, someone should explain the content verbally. In the case of smallholders and their temporary workers or small farms with less than 10 workers, a labor agreement can be made through verbal communication instead of a written document. Let's do some quizzes to verify your understanding on the last half of this session. On a tea farm, the workers start their work at 7 a.m. They work nonstop and finish at around 3 p.m. and go home to have lunch. Is this compliant with the corresponding criterion? The answer is no. According to Critical Criterion 4.10, workers need to have a meal break every 6 hours. In this case, the workers are working for 8 hours without a meal break. Therefore, it is not compliant with the criterion. At a coffee mill or a coffee cooperative, an important machine for coffee processing broke down once last year. A large volume of coffee cherries was accumulating without being able to be processed and were going to be lost. The mechanics of the cooperative offered themselves to work overtime to fix the machine as quickly as possible. They worked for 72 hours in total on that week. The cooperative paid the mechanics for the overtime at the rate defined by the law of the country. Is this still compliant with the corresponding criterion? The answer is yes. The overtime work of the mechanics exceeded the 60-hour limit, but this situation was an emergency with a risk of significant loss of the harvest. It happened only for 1 week and only once last year. The overtime work was voluntary and was paid at the rate defined by law. Therefore, it still meets Critical Criterion 4.11. The farm manager of a tea farm gave 2 weeks of paid vacations to the permanent workers at the factory last year. The tea harvesters of the farm did not get paid vacations because some of them work part-time and some of them come to work on an irregular basis. Therefore, they do not deserve 2 weeks of paid vacation. Is this farm still compliant with the corresponding criterion? The answer is no. According to criterion B4.23, part-time or temporary workers also deserve paid vacations that correspond to their work time. For example, half-time workers should be given 1 week of paid vacations. This farm did not give any paid vacations to the harvesters, so it is not compliant with the criterion. A permanent worker on a tea farm had a baby. The farm manager gave her a maternity leave of 3 months after the baby was born. Her salary was suspended during the leave, but the farm manager promised that she can come back to the same position and receive the same salary when she is back. Is this still compliant with the corresponding criterion? The answer is no. According to criterion B4.25, female workers with a baby should receive their full salary during the maternity leave. In this case, the worker's salary was suspended during her maternity leave, so it is against the criterion. A wife of a cocoa smallholder had a baby. She went back to work on her cocoa farm 5 weeks after the baby was born. Is this still compliant with the corresponding criterion? The answer is yes. Criterion B 4.25 does not apply to smallholders. Smallholders are self-employed and they have their autonomy to decide how they want to work. Therefore, going back to work on the farm 5 weeks after birth is still compliant with the criterion. A cocoa smallholder hired 4 workers for 2 months to help him with the cocoa harvesting. Before hiring them, the farmer verbally explained to them the employment conditions, including the work content, working hours, payment, and benefits. There is no written labor agreement signed by both parties. Is this farmer still compliant with the corresponding criterion? The answer is yes. Criterion C 4.22 requires that work conditions are clearly explained to the workers. In the case of smallholders, verbal communication is accepted. Therefore, this farm is still compliant with the criterion. Wages and working hours are very sensitive topics. An unfair wage or unfair working hours are exploitations of workers, and it significantly affects their lives and their health in the long run. Let us provide fair working conditions to the workers so that they are happy, healthy, and committed to work for the farm for the long term.